The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our March 3rd Thursday webinar. I'm Margot Hoffman, and on behalf of the California Council for Excellence, the Mid-Atlantic Alliance for Performance Excellence, Oklahoma Quality Foundation, Partners in Performance Excellence Northwest, Quality New Mexico, Southwest Alliance for Excellence, and the Partnership for Excellence, we welcome you to our monthly webinar. This month, we're going to hear about the power of storytelling from two gentlemen from very different backgrounds. So I think it's going to be a very enlightening and interesting webinar. I did put a handout of the presentation. There's not a lot in this presentation, but there might be information that you want. It's in the handout box if you'd like it. And we are recording this webinar. Before we get started, I want to make a few announcements. First of all, if you have any questions, please put them in the question box in the control panel. We will be holding questions until the end, since there's going to be a lot of stories that are shared in this webinar. We want to make sure that we're not disrupting our speakers. So put your questions in the question box, and we will get to them after both of our speakers talk. And then we also have a few announcements that we'll be making. Then we'll introduce our speakers and get on with our program for the day. We'll conclude the webinar with the introduction of our next webinar and just a thank you to everyone. As a reminder, all of our programs have events throughout the year. So please access the program that you're affiliated with and get engaged with your program, and hopefully you can attend some of those events coming up. A couple announcements that I would like to make is, first of all, one big upcoming event is the National Baldrige Program's Quest for Excellence. It's just a couple weeks away on April 7th through the 10th in the Washington, D.C. area. So if you're thinking about going to that conference, there's still time to register for it. I also want to let you know that the Partnership for Excellence will be offering an application writing web series. It will meet weekly for an hour for 6 weeks if you're interested in engaging in that. And before we introduce our speakers, we want to thank our organizational members. Most of our organizations are 501(c)(3)s, and we couldn't do the work that we do to help organizations on their performance excellence journeys without the support of our amazing organizational members. So we send our thanks out to all of you, and thank you for helping us do what we do. I would now like to introduce Gail Hammer with the Quality New Mexico program, who's going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Margot, and good morning, everyone. My name is Gail Hammer. I'm a quality practitioner serving New Mexico over 30 years. I come to you today as a member of the Quality New Mexico Board of Directors, and with me today are two fine individuals who also serve on the board. I'm delighted to introduce you to Henry Silentman and Dr. Bill Watt. These two New Mexico gentlemen come from very different backgrounds, yet share equal respect for the power of storytelling, particularly when it comes to embedding culture. First, a little about Henry. I hope you already read his bio because I want to share a few other interesting items about Henry. Henry may be the only state and national examiner representing the Navajo Nation, that I know anyway, and we are just so glad he works with us all to spread the message about performance excellence to the nation and beyond. Not only is Henry the only Navajo examiner, he may also be the only individual in the world mentally scarred by a calculator that looks like an owl. He won the calculator as a consolation prize for coming in third in his 6th grade spelling bee. He doesn't remember the word he missed or who came in first, but he remembers the owl calculator. You might also want to ask Henry about how he once needed a laser pointer to get bread to eat, or you can let him tell you how he has to remind people that there are no rhinoceroses on the Navajo Nation. Okay, now on to Bill. So Bill has been active with Quality New Mexico throughout his career and actually helped Quality New Mexico get going 30 years ago. Most recently, Bill was instrumental in opening the door for 3 northern New Mexico counties, Rio Arriba, Los Alamos, and Santa Fe. They have now joined the Communities of Excellence as one group in the 2023 cohort. Bill's career at the National Laboratory as best and brightest scientist began in an unexpected way. When Bill's mother asked him what he discussed with the admissions person at Williams College, he told her mainly baseball. He liked the friendly, relaxed atmosphere, and that is where he went. And then when considering where to go to get his PhD in chemistry, Bill chose Caltech. Why? Because it was 26 minutes from his dorm room to the seat in general admission on the 6th deck behind home plate at Dodgers Stadium, observing 19 games in his first year. Another interesting tidbit about Bill is he's probably the only person on this webinar who has had his head inside a bear's mouth. Well, that's an interesting story, but not particularly pertinent to performance excellence. So hopefully the stories that he shares today will be. So with that important background information, let's all welcome Henry and Bill.
Hey, thank you, Gail, for that great introduction. Thank you to the Baldrige folks for inviting me to participate in today's webinar and presentation. And so my name is Henry Silentman. I work for Navajo Nation and I do economic development for Navajo Nation. I'm here in Shiprock, New Mexico. So good morning from Shiprock, New Mexico. So as you see, we're talking about storytelling, and there's a picture of a storytelling clay pottery pot, and it depicts an elder's stories with her New Mexico pottery pot, and I think, you know, looking at storytelling for Native Americans, it kind of goes back to how for our language, the Navajo language, it was only an oral language up until the 1940s and 50s. That's how we participated as a code-talker during the World War II, and so that kind of you know has that history of being oral and how you want to pass down, you know, information to the next generation. So we share history, we share our customs, and we share our rites of passage, and, you know, our ceremonies, you know, of the tribe to the younger folks, and to remind everyone, what we want to remind them of. So a lot of this, you know, the songs that we do in ceremony, we sing, you know, and they're stories, you know, the stories that are passed down to our medicine folk, our medicine people. And when we learn a song, you know, we learn the melody, we learn the lyrics, and once we learn the song, we begin to learn the story behind the lyrics, and, you know, and what important messages that they translate to us. And we look at our, you know, present situation to view it in that different lens, and to possibly, you know, gain a perspective on, you know, either our current problems or current situations. So we tell our stories to young people to tell them how to live right, you know, to be productive, and how to, you know, stay connected with their communities. I think those are good goals for anyone. And so the story about the calculator. So the story is, you know, it was my consolation prize. It's one of my favorite stories. You know, my personality is I'm a stickler for proper spelling and proper grammar, and I will yell at the TV if I see something that's, you know, spelled wrong, or someone uses improper grammar. And you know, if you use the wrong present perfect conjugation, then, you know, I'll you know, it's or if someone uses a gerund incorrectly, I will, you know, be a little dismayed, and you might go off the handle a little bit, you know. But in my story, you know, the owl, it's it's kind of a bad omen for Navajo and Navajo culture. And I think, I don't know what was in the mind of the school folks and what they were thinking when they had an owl calculator as a consolation prize. But I think that just shows me the importance of, how the owl was sent to me to, get my spelling and my grammar correct, and make sure that I do not do wrong in spelling and grammar. So. But I remember talking to folks, another one of my stories that I talk about is, my last name. My last name is Silent Man. And a lot of folks, they wonder about my name, and they wonder, I did an internet search to find out about how common my last name is. And there was, safe to say there's a small number. And many people asked me about my name. I didn't, at the beginning, I didn't know a lot about my last name, but, I began to develop my story about my name. And, I talked to folks, where I work is where my paternal grandfather was living in this area. And so I met folks that, that are, come from that area, and they told us about, other folks that are named Silent Man, and then there's some folks that are, across the way that are, their last name is Mute. So I think it's safe to say that, maybe there was a mute person, gentleman maybe at the trading post or somewhere that got his name from, Anglo traders. And so I think, that's kind of one of the stories that's really personal to me. And I try to tell that, when people ask, and I do have the domain for silentman.com. So I kind of let people know, and there's a story before that too. But I think for a good story, it has to have a point. The point of the owl is to make sure that I spell things correctly. It has relevance, still relevant in today's, we still need to use good grammar and good spelling, and also it can be entertaining as well. And so that brings me to my rhinoceros story. So the rhinoceros, my rhinoceros on the Navajo Nation. So again, my character is that I'm kind of meticulous about history and how it matters and what we do. And I work for the Navajo Nation. I'm an economic developer. I will write correspondence, create brochures, order business cards, and we use our Navajo Nation seal on a lot of things that we do. And the Navajo Nation seal was established, by our government in 1952. And so there was thought into, all parts of that seal, the semblance of each part, and the number of arrows, the corn, the rainbow and such. So in the U.S. government with its, Bureau of Engraving, they take care of the seal for the United States, and you don't have to worry about how many feathers on the eagle there are and how they overlap each other. You don't have to think about, what degree the arrows are angled and such, but, everything is consistent, and you can go about your day, without worrying about the U.S. seal. But on the Navajo Nation, we don't have a Bureau of Engraving, so to keep our seal authentic and genuine as it was when they thought about it. So, but if you go to the Wikipedia website, you find a variation of the Navajo Nation seal. And so on the authentic seal, you have a horse, a cow, and a sheep in the middle of the seal. And in the Wikipedia version, it has an animal that looks like a rhinoceros. And I tell folks about how, Navajo Nation don't have rhinoceroses on the nation. So I don't know where that animal came from. I think I think it should matter that we, have the correct representation of our, government seal and such. So that's kind of how I think it's, important. And so I researched the actual seal, and And the horse, the cow, and the sheep, they're actually very skinny. I guess they were a lot skinnier in the 50s. So, but I guess that's another story. But when I was asked to do the presentation, by Baldrige about storytelling, I automatically thought to myself but stories are anecdotal. My years as an examiner tells me that, we need to get to the process directly. We need to talk about approach, deployment, learning, integration. And I look back at the, some of the, well, I thought back at some of those applications that I reviewed, and I remembered, a lot of the stories that they told. And, it might have been at the time, a tough time to, see through the verbiage to find the process. But I guess that's why, we have more than one person on a team to review the application. I think, Baldrige applications, they can be entertaining and memorable, and, I encourage everyone to, tell a story, if it's a story about, why you don't eat raspberries after brushing your teeth, or why you don't mix Pine Sol and Clorox, I think it's, your story, it's your story to tell. But so I'm going to hand it off to Bob. Bill.
Okay, thank you, Henry. Again, I am thrilled to be part of this session. And as you might guess, when I was in graduate school for my PhD in chemistry, there weren't any courses on communications, let alone storytelling. But when I got to work at Los Alamos National Lab, I began to observe that some of the more effective leaders and managers would use storytelling to convey key messages to their employees. And I got to observe my boss in the early 90s do just that on an important issue. I need to set the context for what life was like at Los Alamos National Lab in the early 90s. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and so the nation was expecting a peace dividend. And since we worked in national security at the laboratory, our budgets were shrinking. We also had, in the early 90s, experienced a major environment, safety, and health audit. We had 165 auditors on site for 7 weeks. And at the end of that, our lab director, a man named Sig Hecker, thought that we needed to go on our quality journey. And so he created a new office of quality policy and performance. And he asked the person to lead it, a guy named John Wetton, who was a geologist who had come to the laboratory from the University of Washington, where he was a professor. And then John asked me to be his deputy. And so we were going to lead the quality journey for the laboratory. At the same time, the University of California, which managed and operated the laboratory for the Department of Energy at the time, initiated for the first time with the DOE a performance-based contract. And so again, more attention being focused on performance. And it was clear at that time, with our budget shrinking, that we needed to increase efficiency, reduce overhead, and if we were going to compete effectively with the other national laboratories. It was in this context that my boss was asked by the lab director to communicate the message to the lab workforce that we needed to sort of tighten our belts and start being more efficient in the work we were doing. And so my boss took an unusual approach. In major meetings, with hundreds of employees, he would bring out a Dr. Seuss book called Thidwick the Big-Hearted Moose. And he would tell them the story of Thidwick to convey the message of how we had gotten into a position where we needed to become more streamlined and more efficient if we wanted to continue to do the work we were doing on behalf of the U.S. taxpayer. So what is the story of Thidwick the Big-Hearted Moose? Thidwick and his fellow moose were going around munching moose moss, and they were doing well, and Thidwick was really happy. And this is the way the lab was before, things had changed in the late 80s and early 90s. Budgets were good, and so we were all happy. And we weren't munching moose moss, but we were doing science and engineering, and there were no budgets were quite robust at the time. And so Thidwick, as he's wandering around the Northlands, there's a little bug, a Bengal bug, who said, "Hey, could I ride on your antlers? They look really nice. Could I go up there and sit on them?" And Thidwick, of course, said, "Oh, of course, you can do that." And so the Bengal bug jumped onto the antlers, and a little while later, the Bengal bug noticed a tree spider, and the tree spider said, "Hey, that looks pretty nice up on the antlers. Could I join you?" And the Bengal bug said, yeah, sure. And, Thidwick didn't mind. And then the next thing was there was a Zinazoo bird who said, "Hey, that looks pretty great. Could I join you?" And so he did. And the Zinazoo bird, though, then started pulling out hairs from Thidwick's head, and he, which sort of hurt, and Thidwick wasn't real happy with that, but it was okay, and he started to, he went along with it. And then the Zinazoo bird, another bird came in, and that was the bird's wife, and so they were sitting on the nest and having a good time. But even worse, the wife's uncle, who was a woodpecker, flew in, and he started drilling holes in Thidwick's antlers, which Thidwick didn't really like, but went along with it. He was a big-hearted moose, and with those holes, they looked really attractive to a group of squirrels, so they joined. And the next thing you knew, there was also a bobcat and a turtle. And then Thidwick was starting, this was getting pretty annoying. His friends were saying, "You got to tell him to leave," but Thidwick couldn't do that. He was big-hearted. And so it was, as the time moved on, it was getting to the fall when it was time to cross the lake to get to the warmer climates where you could still find good food. And so Thidwick said, "Okay, it's time for me to cross the lake, swim across the lake." But all the people up, all the animals up in the antlers said, wait, no, we need to vote on this. And of course, Thidwick voted to cross the lake, and all the others voted to stay. And Thidwick, sort of was frustrated, but he went along with it and stayed on the other side. And a fox and a bear joined, sitting up in his antlers. But then something really bad happened. It was the opening of hunting season. And so suddenly the hunters were taking pot shots at Thidwick, and he was running around, and he couldn't move as fast as normal because of all the animals up in his antlers. And he eventually got cornered by the hunters, and he thought, uh-oh, this is the end of Thidwick. But then he remembered something, and he smiled because he knew what day it was. And it was the day on which his antlers fall off. And he shook his head, and his antlers flew off, and he was free and clear to swim across the lake and munch moose moss with his fellow moose. And so that was the story that my boss told to folks, and saying, when times were good, we started adding things that were nice to have, but not really necessary for our mission. And so we're at the time now where we need to shake our head and let those antlers, with all the extra items that we had added to our work, to fly off, and so we can be more efficient and can join the other national labs and and competing and serving the U.S. taxpayer through research and development and national security. And that actually turned out to be quite effective. And it was really interesting to hear and see this geology professor up on the stage with a Fidwick, the Big-Hearted Moose, and the Dr. Seuss book, talking to all these PhD scientists and engineers, but it worked. And so I learned a lesson at that time that storytelling could be really important. And that was good because at the time, as I may have mentioned before, the University of California, which managed the lab for the government, had negotiated the first performance-based contract for actually not just Los Alamos, but for also the two other labs that it managed, Lawrence Livermore National Lab and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And they realized they needed to set up an office to oversee the labs, and there was going to be a vice president in charge of the laboratories. And so I was invited along with one other person, the head of HR at Los Alamos, to help select the first head of that office overseeing the laboratories for the University of California. And so we started having bi-weekly trips out to Oakland, which is where the University of California's headquarters were. And my friend, my colleague, head of the HR, knew there was a hotel, actually it was in Berkeley near Oakland, that he'd like to stay at because up the street a bit was this great old bookstore that he loved to go to. So I said, sure, I'll stay wherever, that makes sense to me. And so we went to this place to stay at, and we'd walk up the street, and he said to go towards the bookstore, but he said, there's really this nice place to get a quick bite to eat before we'd go to our meetings at the university. And so we walked up the street and went into this little shop for breakfast, and I was looking around. They had pastries displayed, and I ordered a large fresh squeezed orange juice, and then I was trying to figure out which pastry to have, and looking at them, I saw something that looked pretty good. Look, it was an apricot tart, and so I said, oh, I'd like an apricot tart, and he got it out for me, and that's what I had. The tart was good. It wasn't the best apricot tart I ever had, but it was okay, and it wasn't that cheap, but it wasn't expensive either. So it wasn't. I didn't go for it for price, and more for looks. But anyway, it was okay, and so we had a good little breakfast, went to our meetings, and a couple of weeks later we were back, creatures of habit, and we went into the same place, and I was looking around. I ordered my orange juice, and I looked at the pastries, and I didn't see the apricot tart, and the man behind the counter said, "You're looking for the apricot tart, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And so I got some out back, and so he brought one out, and I had it, and I thought that was really nice. And then 2 weeks later, again, we were coming back in for our meetings and walking into this place to get our breakfast, and when we walked in, there waiting for me was my orange juice, large orange juice, and an apricot tart. And that secured my customer loyalty. And I think I would tell this story to say, it's not necessarily having the best product that can build customer loyalty or the best price, but it can be the customer relationships that really are the key to building loyalty. And that was a story I used time after time, and I just felt it was a great way to get people thinking about how to satisfy their customers. There are many ways to do it, and you just need to figure out which is the approach your organization is going to use to try to build that customer, serve your customers well, and build that customer loyalty. And for a theoretical chemist, which is what I was, that was sort of a different way of behaving, but I found it worked well. The storytelling was effective in conveying messages that otherwise just numbers, which I loved, wouldn't always work. Let's see, do I have time for one more story, Bob?
Bill, yes, you have one more story and then we'll go to questions.
Okay, so this is a story I heard from a guy named Pace Van Devender, who was a senior manager at Sandia National Laboratories. And Pace had an opportunity to actually fly out of San Diego and land on the deck of one of our nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. And while he was out there, he heard a story which he brought back not only to Sandia, but to Los Alamos, because it was really a very important story about environment, safety, and health, safety in particular. On a carrier flight deck is probably about the most dangerous set of routine operations that go on in the military. Landing planes and having them take off, it's a very dangerous enterprise, but very important for our nation's defense. So what they have to develop really high performance work teams. And remember, most of the members of those work teams are really young people, 19-year-olds, fresh out of high school. And so the Navy works hard on building a safety culture. And one of the things they do is they make it clear that anyone on the flight deck, if they see something that's wrong, that they can stop operations and to resolve that safety issue. So one day they were launching the jets off the flight deck, and one of the 19-year-olds was looking around and he noticed that there was a wrench sitting on the flight deck, and he immediately stopped flight operations. And that was because a loose piece of equipment like a wrench could get sucked up into the jet engines and you could have a major accident. So after he had stopped operations, they fixed the problem and resumed, and then they completed that at launching all the jets. Suddenly someone came up to him and said, "Hey, you got to go see the commanding officer." And he was really, being 19 years old, he was pretty worried about that. He thought, uh-oh, maybe I screwed up. What did I do? So he went up and, to the commanding officer's office and knocked on the door and was asked to come in. And there he was, face to face with the head of the ship. And what that man did, I forget whether he was a captain or an admiral. In any case, he just went over and shook that 19-year-old's hand and said, "Thank you." And so that's the key, that the leaders need to convey a consistent message. He thanked the 19-year-old for stopping the flight operations and on this, multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier, because safety came first. And that is always, so the leaders of the organizations need to take every opportunity to convey a consistent message of what's important to the organization. And that's the story that I heard that was used to say, if safety is number one, it has to be number one for everyone, and it needs to be number one in all situations. And so that I found was a really important and a good way to express that message of safety as being important to the operations of a national laboratory also. So with that, those are the stories that I found really useful in my career to convey how to improve our performance, whether in safety or our efficiency as we do our science and technology. And with that, Henry and I'm sure would be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you,
Well,
Bill.
good morning, everyone.
Oh, sorry, Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Bittner. I'm with the Mid-Atlantic Alliance for Performance Excellence. And we're going to go ahead and transition to a little bit of a question and answer phase here. So if you have some questions, type those into the question box. Margot, if you can kind of monitor that for us. But I've got a couple that can get us started. So Henry and Bill, I mean, we've all talked to folks that are just, without hesitation, they'll say, you know what, I am not a storyteller. And that you take these folks, you get them in a social situation, maybe it's out for lunch or at the backyard barbecue, and once they start talking about last year's vacation or something they want to do, you find out, they really are quite competent storytellers. And so it's not that we don't do it, we just compartmentalize it. What are your thoughts? I mean, should all of us try to get better at telling stories in a business or work environment? Is that a skill worth honing? Henry, what do you think?
Bob, well, I think all of us has stories to tell. For most everyone, you ask them, what did they do during COVID? If it's what happened, during 9/11 or something like that. And I think people will tell, will tell, will have what's happened to them and in their mind, and they'll be able to convey it if you ask them and talk about themselves and talk about, have a conversation starter about, what did you do during COVID? Spend a lot of time at the pool or something like that, and, you can, it's basically, you want to, find out, about someone and you're, if they have a story with a message, and that's all the better for it.
Yeah. Bill, anything you would add?
Yeah, I think it's often stories are what are easier to remember. And so when you're trying to communicate points, that it's, as I mentioned earlier, just doing it with numbers, which, scientists and engineers may be happy to do, or graphs, it's not quite as effective as a story. And the story can also capture elements of a culture that you're trying to build, the behaviors you're trying to encourage, and you can do that much more effectively with a story. And again, if it's easier to remember, then it's more likely to be executed in the future. And so that's why stories are extremely important in communication. And again, the most effective managers and leaders that I've seen at the laboratory and beyond were good storytellers.
Yeah, Bob, I think it's a lot about, sharing your best practices, within your organization. If you have a story, to tell people, make sure you use good grammar and good spelling, then, that'd be a great way to convey that.
Yeah. One of the things I jotted down as you guys were talking, and what I wrote is stories are stickier than slides. I mean, they just are, and we can remember stories, and we know that they can really help in conveying complex ideas. And I think maybe we hear stories differently. There's an emotional connection there that you don't get in the slide. I mean, how do you guys react to that? Any thoughts around that?
But I think the emotional aspect that you point out, Bob, is very important, because research on how our brain develops and how we learn, it's clear that really what underpins the cognitive skills that we have are the social emotional learning. And so that's where the storytelling, which pulls at those emotional and social strings, is really critical and more powerful than approaches that just appear to the cognitive side.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, when we're trying to understand somebody, we want to hear stories from them. If it's a younger generation, maybe they have a story to tell, and we try to be empathic if we can, and to understand their situations, and I think that's a lot of the basics about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and just learning about other people's stories. I think a lot of people have personal stories, and I think that's where you share your personality and your personal history.
I'm somewhat reminded of that book by Chip and Dan Heath. They wrote a book called The Power of Moments. And, if any of us look back at our lives and we look at the moments that were transitions or pivot points, we think about every one of those in terms of a story. So yeah, really good point. My next question, if a good story had a recipe, what would be the three main ingredients? Well, I'll let you take this one first.
Well, I think it's about being personal. You're there to share a story, so you can be share your personal history and such, and have relevance. Have relevance to the point you're trying to make, and then have that point. If it's a point about good grammar, or using the correct seals. That's all a part of having a good story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, Henry. The key is to engage your audience. So it needs to be interesting at some level. And the other key point that Henry made is it really does need to be pertinent. You need to relate it to what a key issue that the organization may be facing, or trying to reinforce some key sets of behaviors in the organization that are critical for success. That's why I didn't talk about the story of my head in a bear's mouth, because I couldn't figure out how to relate it to something that's pertinent today to today's topic. It's an interesting story, but it's more of just a story.
Yeah. We've all read about companies like Zappos, or maybe it's the Ritz-Carlton, that have stories that usually around customer service that almost seem to go viral. When you're telling stories, how important is it to you that story have a life beyond you, that somebody else can take it and share that same story and make that same point? I mean, is that important, or don't you really think about that much?
Yeah, I think it's important because that's how it permeates the culture. And so the better the story is, the more likely people are going to retell it, and it will spread through the organization. And that's why you notice 2 of the 3 stories I told were stories that I'd heard from others. And I think that whether others have told the apricot tart story, I don't know, but all I know is that the flight deck story and the Thidwick story, I heard from others, and they made a difference for me, and I saw them make a difference for others. And so I think that is a key aspect. And one of the ways you can check if a story is being effective or not if it is effective, you should hear it getting retold. And if you never hear it retold, then you may need to come up with a different story after you find out why it wasn't being retold. Was it too long, too complicated, just not pertinent? What was it?
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree with Bill, and I think a lot of times, if we hear a story and we retell the story, it has relevance to us. If it's I tell a story about one of my friends don't like chocolate because his father told him that he was allergic to chocolate and never grew up eating chocolate, and his father didn't tell him that he was just kidding with him, because that's relevant to me. How can people not like chocolate, Yeah. And I usually, you think about some of those things, and and because it has relevance in your life.
Mhm.
And sometimes the stories aren't necessarily true. I mean, they're like the stories of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and then admitting to it and saying, I cannot tell a lie. It's not clear that really happened, but the basic message of not lying, of integrity, is extremely important. And and so that there, the key was the message. And the story, again, may have been created to convey that message, but it appealed to people enough that it's hung on in our culture. And as Henry said earlier, I mean, cultures often thrive over generations on oral tradition. And that's why, some stories we're telling that were initially told thousands of years ago. And those are very special stories.
Yeah. Is it possible, do you think, to develop stories collectively? Imagine if in our organizations, if in our workplaces, we had groups of employees get together and just to kind of think through or brainstorm or a couple of we're at our best when stories. When does my organization really shine? What does that look like? What happens? And then using those, sharing that across the organization. Could there be benefit or value in doing that? And might it be easier than crafting a story individually?
I think that's doable, and it also could be part of a team building exercise in trying to understand what is it that makes an organization different or gives them a competitive advantage, and and by sharing the different perspectives and experiences, you can, I think collectively you can come up with ideas for what stories may most effectively convey what you're trying to communicate. And so I think that's possible. And I know at the laboratory over the years, the only reason why we could meet some of the national security challenges we met was through, extensive teamwork with people with very diverse perspectives. And so people would talk about, get together and talk about why certain experiments worked or didn't, and how to get things, do things more effectively. And in doing that, you can sometimes, in those discussions, certain incidents may come up, and they realize that, oh, yeah, that captures that learning that we had really well, and you could remember that story, whereas you couldn't necessarily remember the details of the aspect of the experiment that you were trying to execute, but the general story conveyed the key message that you wanted to share. So I think that does flow naturally out of teamwork and taking time. But the key is to take the time to reflect. That's where the learning comes, is from the reflection. And that goes back to the Baldrige process of self-assessment and taking time to reflect is important. Now, I remember a story I heard. This was at when General Motors, spun off the Saturn division, because they knew that they were under pressure from the Japanese. They needed to come up with some better ways of making cars, and so they thought, okay, we set up a separate division. We can they can try new things, and we can learn that way. Well, at Saturn, as they started thinking about their first production model, they said, oh, we really need to take more time before we actually start tooling up. And the people who had with experience at GM said, you can't do that. You'll never, you'll be way behind schedule. You won't get the model out in time. You just can't do that. But they said, well, we want to try. And they did. And lo and behold, and this is similar to what the Japanese were doing, they spent more time up front on the design stage and figure out exactly what they needed. And then once they had made those decisions, then they could actually go into the tool up phase, went much more quickly, and they got things out on time and actually cost less money.
Yeah.
So, and that's the power of taking the time to reflect.
Yeah. There's
Yeah,
almost
almost
as much.
well, let me just,
Now, go ahead, Henry.
Oh, well, I was just saying, incorporating, storytelling, is important in knowledge management, and your innovation process, how do you find out if a process is not working unless you listen to the stories of people on the line, doing the processes, and I think that it's having that incorporation is key to understanding how you can make your products better and how you can make your processes more aligned, or and so I think that's it's important in any excellent organization.
Yeah, that's right. If you're not sharing the stories of what's happening, where sort of the rubber is meeting the road, you're not going to improve. So you need processes to try to make sure that you do share and that communications are open. And again, that's critical for leaders to create an open environment so that people feel safe telling stories, even if they're not, especially if they're not, in a sense, positive stories where problems occurred. Because I know, I'm thinking one lab director we had was, when he came in, he said, boy, I really need to hear what's going on, and et cetera. But at the first senior management meeting where someone raised was telling a story about a problem, he basically shut that manager down, and everyone got the message. And so that director, who was a really good person, but wound up struggling because people felt he didn't want to hear the bad news. And so stories aren't always good, about positive things. They're also the stories about the things that aren't working. And it's important to build a culture where all those stories are welcome.
Yeah, great points. Margot, how are we doing on time? I'm guessing you probably need to wrap us up.
Yeah, we're getting close to wrapping up. We did get a couple questions. I think I was able to answer them in the control panel. One was if the recording will be available, and yes, we will be sending out an email with a link to a Vimeo library. And the other question was very similar to one of them that you asked, so it did get answered. And we had a comment that I think is very relevant. from Gail, and that is a really good place to pick up stories is at Baldrige conferences. And she's used Baldrige winter stories to make points over the years, and it's been very effective. And I too have done that. There's a lot of great stories to reinforce the processes that our Baldrige recipients have put in place. So I want to thank Bill and Henry and Bob and Gail for bringing this webinar together for us today. It was a enlightening and I thought very interesting topic to have. So thank you for doing that for us. We do have our webinar lined up for next month. It's going to be on generative artificial intelligence, sort of an overview on that and learning about that and examples of it. And it's going to be conducted by John Choate, who is very engaged with artificial intelligence and also with ASQ, where he does a lot of work around this topic. So we hope you could join us on April 18th. You can see there's a link here to register for it, and I will also send that out to everyone after the webinar today. So we want to thank you for joining us. If you are interested in working with one of our programs on your performance excellence journey, please reach out to the appropriate program director, and we have them listed here. If you're from another area of the country that's not covered by these programs, you can reach out to me and I will let you know who the person is that you should work with. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our great presenters for sharing the relevance of storytelling and some of the stories that you've told and used in your particular organizations. And everyone have a great day. Bye, everyone.